Okay, again, I'd like to welcome everybody for today's Friday Speaker Series program. It's titled today, Little House on the Osage Prairie, and it's being presented by Associate Professor of English, Chris Otto, who has been a faculty member here at Jefferson College since 2012. In terms of Chris's academic credentials, he attended Truman State University, where he majored in English and graduated in 1993. From there, he then went on to attend Southeast Missouri State University, receiving a graduate teaching assistantship while graduating with honors at that institution. He also received an assistantship at the University of Missouri-Columbia in library and informational science, and then in 2001 completed the requirements for his Master of Arts degree in library science. So a very well accomplished faculty member for sure. He's also a member of the Missouri Folklore Society, the National Council of Teachers of English, the two-year College English Association, and his research interests include Southern literature, American Indian literature, and folklore. Chris has also been very instrumental in terms of the college's very first student exchange program, as we had a group of students here a couple of weeks ago from Germany, and Chris was fortunate enough to teach our German literature class for the first group of Jefferson College students that went to Germany this past summer. So he's involved in that program as well. Well, Chris's program today will focus on understanding the Osage Indians and their role in Missouri's history. He'll look at some treaties, some historical documents, and travel narratives presenting the story of the Osage removal from Missouri and offer some insight into their life in Oklahoma. He'll also connect this to the stories that we've mentioned before about the Ingalls and their contact with the Osage. And again, as we mentioned in the earlier part of today, we're so very pleased and excited about the partnership between Jefferson College and the County Library, bringing Caroline Frazier here to our region October the 16th and 17th. There'll be 3 free presentations, one on the 16th at Northwest High School, one here at the Jefferson County, or the Jefferson College Library, I should say, on October the 17th, and then the final program at the Fox Service Center on October 17th in the evening as well. All 3 of those programs are free to the public, so we hope that you'll make a note to tell your friends and be available for those programs. Also be remiss today if I didn't encourage you, if you've not had an opportunity, to look at the fine display that's being put together by the Jefferson College Library staff. Over here are a number of artifacts and books and collections, and in fact, some of the arrowheads that are on display today are actually from the family of former Governor Jay Nixon. And so again, you may want to take just a few minutes to look at that today. Well, with that, again, we continue our theme in terms of Little House on the Prairie. As I mentioned, today's topic essentially is Little House on the Osage Prairie. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speaker today, Chris Otto.
Thanks for being here. And how's everybody doing? Eat that chocolate cake. It's worth the price of admission. I like speaking here because I always get a big end piece, and it's so good. I know it's probably not good for me. I just wanted to kind of reiterate the Carolyn Frazier book, Prairie Fires. If you how many of you have read, I mean, I know he asked you if you've read, how many of you have read that book? If you haven't, get a copy of it. It is really, really good. And it is strikes a balance between, it's just meticulously researched, and it is it's exceedingly readable. I think you'll find it fascinating. So I want to talk a little bit about how Laura Ingalls Wilder ended up on this piece of land in southern Kansas. And I'm going to tell the story of how the Osage people ended there. This thing is really going to drive me kind of crazy. And so what I want to start with here is this map in the center, which this sort of depicts the extent of the Osage traditional ancestral territories. And so as you can see here, it starts well in the east. This is in southwest Pennsylvania, all through the Ohio River Valley, and then it encompasses Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and into Louisiana. So at the height of their power, right, they would have controlled much of this region right here. In the prehistory, how did they get here? There seems to be a couple of different narratives. One suggests that they really were an eastern people and who kind of, for the most part, lived in this region right here on the Ohio River Valley. And then in the 1600s, they were pushed out by the Iroquois during the Beaver Wars. Another sort of narrative suggests that they were in the Cahokia Mounds region. And then after that city kind of collapsed, they dispersed out into the Plains region. And in fact, in the 1990s, they bought Sugarloaf Mound, which was the last mound on the Missouri side of the river. You remember that? And you could see that mound from Highway 55. And I remember seeing it as a kid. There was a house that sat on top of it, and it looked really weird. Many of you are nodding your heads so that you remember that. The Osage bought it, took the house down, and now they kind of want to pair that with the Cahokia Mounds and make that a national park. It is a UN World Heritage Site, but I think that it would also make a great national park as well. Okay, so I have a quote here from Little House on the Prairie, if you remember that quote. This is something that Pa says, and it is, white people are going to settle this country and we get the best land because we get here first and we get to take our pick. And of course, the kind of problem with this is they were illegally trespassing on land that had been guaranteed to the Osage people. So when you think back to, Michael Landon and the family, and they're all, happy, and they weren't supposed to be there, and they could have faced some that was a dangerous move. To move into that area. I'm going to skip over this. This is another quote from the book, and this is essentially where Laura Ingalls recounts essentially the removal of the Osage people from Kansas. And I'm not going to, you can go get the book and read all that. So the next slide here then kind of details a little bit, how did the Ingalls Wilder, how did they end up on this piece of land? So this little outline box right here is in southern Kansas. That's the Osage Diminished Reserve. This is, remember how you saw that huge area with Missouri, Kansas? So this is what they were reduced to by 1869. This little part of southern Kansas. Is anybody from southern Kansas? All right, well, I don't think that, this is pretty small and it's arid and it's not that exciting. But this map over here with this crazy shapes, this shows you all the movements of Charles Ingalls and his wife, Carolyn. So in 1867, they're up in Wisconsin. 1869, they're down in Independence, Kansas, which is, so this box over here is a blow-up of Montgomery County. And this is where they were. The Ingalls Wilder cabin is this red star right here. So it's well within the Osage Diminished Reserve. Then they go back to Wisconsin. Then they go to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Then they go to Iowa. Then they go back to Minnesota. Then they go to South Dakota. Then they go to Iowa, back to Minnesota, South Dakota. And then Laura and Almanzo, they moved to Mansfield down in the Ozarks. And then that's where they end up staying. So if you read the Carolyn Fraser book, it's interesting. Why was Charles Ingalls moving around so much? Was he didn't fight in the Civil War? Was he kind of trying to stay ahead of somebody? Did he owe somebody money? Was he just a bad? He really was according to Carolyn Fraser's book, he did not make good economic decisions. Everything that he did turned out to be a bust. And so they moved a lot. And so they ended up here. Now, if I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but if you trespass on Osage land, one of the common penalties was you paid with your head. And so this was not something that I don't think I would have been willing to take that chance, but he did. And so just to give you a little bit of background about what it was like on the Osage Diminished Reserve, this is a quote from Indian agent Isaac Gibson. This is part of his annual report that he had to file with the federal government to kind of talk about, all right, this is what it's like out here in Kansas. And Gibson says to Hogue, here he's quoting the Indians. He's quoting the Osage. So the Osage said to him, "We sold our lands to the government nearly 2 years ago in the Scorsese Treaty." Sturgis, by the way, owned the Leavenworth Railroad. And so he was a railroad guy. He wanted to get his hands on that land to build railroads. "We have received no pay, but the white man came at once and took our lodges and our corn patches and has bought a great many cattle that are eating our winter food. The commissioner said we should have a new country, but you won't let us go there nor protect us here. If the government doesn't like the treaty, why don't they let us make another one? We have no place to live. We want to live in peace with the white man, but we can't here. He robs us of our home." And so this is a quote from Gibson's letter where he's trying to give his superiors an idea of what the Osage are experiencing on this slim piece of land in southern Kansas. Well, I wanted to just sort of make the point here that the Little House on the Prairie, her story of settlement, and even the TV show and the movies and the way that it became popular as a child kind of supports this idea of manifest destiny, kind of this concept of it was inevitable that Europeans would settle from sea to sea. And I like this. I remember this particular painting in my American history book. I don't know if anybody else remembers that, but this is a painting by John Gass titled American Progress, and progress here is depicted as a classically adorned woman, and she's bringing the telegraph wires to the west, and she's bringing law and civilization, and you can see there are all different types of modes of transportation here. Here comes the railroads, here comes the boats, there's farmers. And then over here, oh yeah, in this little cluster, there's these Indians, and they're looking over their shoulder, and they're like, where are we going? And my favorite part of the whole painting, you can't really see very well, is this little bear right here, and he's looking over, like, you know, that's kind of pushing everything, wild things, Indians, everything, you got to go this way to get out of the way of progress. And this was a line from Little House on the Prairie until 1952. And there's a line in the book, and it says, "There were no people, only Indians lived there." And so the assumption then is that they're not really Indians. And it was like that until a reader noted it and sent it in to the publisher of Little House on the Prairie and said, "Hey, I don't know, do you think we should change that?" And so then they did after 52, and it said there were no settlers, only Indians lived there. So I think it's important to remember, when I learned American history, the Indians were at the first Thanksgiving, right? We had Squanto, and they show them how to plant corn. And then they kind of go away. And then Indians come back again like in 1830, when Jackson is elected president, and we have the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee. And then they kind of go away again. And then sometimes they come back again on the, the Dakota Wars and the wars for the land further west. And the point, one of the points of the discussion today is that Indians are always there, and in particular, the Osage people had been successfully dealing with different Europeans for hundreds of years. I'm going to talk about the French, I'll talk about the Spanish, I'll talk a little bit about the British, and then I'll talk about the Americans. And so my argument is that this was in no way sort of inevitable, that this was based on choices that people made, and that sometimes the choices were influenced by a certain degree of ethnocentrism. And so let's talk a little bit about the Osage. The Osage, that word doesn't really mean anything in their language. They call themselves Miukanska, people of the middle waters. The Osage, the word Osage, is when the French first got here, they asked these Illinois people, hey, who lives over here? And then they said something like, Wasazi. Well, to make that W sound when you write French, like if you were to write we in French, it's O-U-I or something like that. So it's O-S, right? A-C-H-E is how it sort of, then like an English person would pick up that map and read a French spelling of Wasazi, and so then it becomes Osage. So really, when they ask these Illinois people who lives over there, Osage in the Illini language means like dangerous person or enemy or somebody not to mess around with, like this microphone. Don't mess with this microphone. It will make you look bad. And so the Osage are a Dehegi and Siouan people, and that means they are closely related linguistically and culturally to the Ponca, the Omaha, the Kansa, and I always forget one of them, the Omaha, the Kansa, the Ponca, the Quapaw. And as a kid, my grandparents lived in Cape Girardeau. My parents are from Cape Girardeau. And we would go down to Capahaw Park. Have you ever been there? It's not Capahaw, it's Quapaw. That's who those people were. And so I didn't realize that until I got a lot older, that was also. So the idea the point that I'm making is that a lot of times the words that we have for Native American people are just these kind of weird corruptions that were based on what some French person wrote down because they were kind of here first, and then they were read by someone who spoke English. Okay, so on to some kind of physical depictions. So these are great paintings by George Catlin, and he came to the Missouri and captured these images on paper. And so he said they are the tallest race of men in North America. Few of them are less than 6 feet in stature, and many of them are 6.5 to 7 feet tall. So they were big. Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1805 after the Louisiana Purchase, in their quarter, we are very weak. And that's true, because after the Revolutionary War, the Osage were still really big in stature as well as in size, and they could marshal several thousand warriors. The United States could not marshal that many troops to meet them on a battlefield. So he knew that this was not going to be something that they would be able to take over by force. Jefferson also said they seem to be the most gigantic men we've ever seen. And then another traveler, John Bradbury, in 1809 said they're so tall, they're so robust, they almost warrant the application of the term gigantic. And I think that looking at this image right here, you really get a sense of how big that they were. And and does anybody know what the average height of a European man was at that time?
5'6".
Yeah, 5'6". How did you know that?
I like history.
She just likes history. Yeah, so just imagine if you're like a 5'6" size, white guy, and all of a sudden you see these huge Indians, and there's like a lot of them. It looked really scary, right? But I think it's important to remember they were eating essentially an organic diet. There was no pollution. They could drink pure water right out of the rivers. They had plenty of sunshine and exercise. And I think that this also, the fact that they were so big, I'm sorry? Oh, I thought somebody said something. That also is a testament to the bounty that was Missouri and the hillsides of that time period. If you read the French diaries, they describe it as an Eden. That there are blackberries and wild plums and grapes, and there's game as just it's amazing. It just seems like it's a land of plenty, and so it was able to. They were able to grow to be such a big people. When 2 times a year the Osage went out onto the plains, and they took established roads and traces or trails. This is a picture that depicts the major Osage travel routes. That's Highway 44. That's Highway 21. We're on an Osage trail. This is Highway 6160. That's like 55 maybe, or 61, 67 right there. But they had roads. They moved. They followed the same paths over and over again. The first paved road in Kansas was a Osage Trail that connected Baxter Springs, Kansas. They would follow these roads. They would go out onto the plains, right? So most of their villages were in the Osage River, or where the Osage meets the Ohio. That was where their semi-permanent villages were. And then they would follow these trails and go out into the plains on Kansas and go on buffalo hunts. They'd go one in late spring, and then they'd go another one. Then they would plant their crops. They would plant the corn, squash, and beans, right? That Squano taught the Pilgrims how to plant that in the first Thanksgiving. They would plant those, then they would leave, go out to the plains, have a buffalo hunt, kill the buffalo, process the meat, come back, store it all, harvest the crops, and then go for one more hunt before winter and try to secure enough meat to survive the winter. They had established campsites between their semi-permanent villages and their hunting grounds. And they would leave these framed structures in place, and then the women would come and cover them with woven mats or different types of skins. The women built the homes. They owned the homes. If a man and a woman divorced, if a woman wanted a divorce, she took his stuff and put it outside of the lodge. And there was a no-fault divorce group. Women could initiate divorce, huh?
Don't give them ideas.
Oh, don't give them any ideas. Yeah, you don't want to go home and find all your stuff outside of the front door. But women could do this. Women in Osage culture had a high degree of autonomy and a high degree of sexual freedom, and they were able to initiate divorces. If a man wanted a divorce, he would go to his father-in-law and take back whatever gift that he gave the father-in-law in order to impress him in the marriage of his daughter. But the Osage people were village residents. They lived in, their main villages now would be near like the Lake of the Ozarks, and then where the Osage comes into the Missouri, which is kind of near, I think it's in Lynn County, near Chamois, and in that region. Those were their main villages, but they would travel widely, and they defended a large area of territory because they were a hunting people. They hunted, but they also lived on their agriculture. So the two things that Jefferson says about Native Americans is he wants them to stop moving around and stay in one place and become farmers, right? Well, they already kind of were, both of those things. And if you compare their sort of movements, they're much more regular, and the pattern is much more normal than that thing that we saw with the Ingalls Wilders kind of going crazy all over the place and not being able to find out where they needed to be. Okay, so the first sort of contact that the Wasazi or the Osage people would have been with the French. And the French have a very freewheeling kind of attitude, and they're going to set some precedents into place that other European powers aren't going to like. So this is Marquette descending the Mississippi River. This is an early drawn map, and you can't see it. I apologize about that. But he has labeled along all these tributaries, this is the Mississippi, he has labeled along all these tributaries the names of the tribes that lived in that area. And so the Osage would be down here. So the Osage and the French form a very tight bond. The French marry into the Osage nation. And Chouteau's descendants have French wives. I think they also have European wives, but they probably, when they came back, maybe they had their stuff out in front of the house. But they intermarry, and they open up kind of free trade. They don't really have licensed traders. So if you are a French guy and, you know, LaSalle, so if we go back a little bit, he claims all of the land that drains, the Mississippi River drains as, this is all French, right? And he puts a thing in it, and now it's France. So if you were a French trader, you could just go out into the land and establish a trading relationship with Indians. And so what the Osage really liked was guns. And once you introduce guns and horses, you have an imbalance of power on the, out on the frontier. When the Spanish get this Louisiana, they're not so happy that the Osage have all these guns. But the French, they thought that if we intermarry, if we learn their language, if we adopt their customs, we will create lifelong customers and a really a good relationship between the Osage and the French. And so the Osage would trade deer skins to the French for guns and other materials. And just to give you an idea, in 1 year, I want to say in 1750s, they sent over 100,000 tanned deer hides back to France. And that's a lot of deer, right? I mean, there's still a lot of deer because we keep hitting them, you know, with our cars out there. But the Osage wanted those guns because the people to the east of them had them. So the people, the Illini, the people in the Ohio Valley, the Cherokee had guns, and without them they were kind of exposed. But they didn't want the guns to go any further west because they didn't want the people behind them to have them to cause any problems. So they kind of have a wide open relationship with the French. They, in 2014, when St. Louis celebrated its 250-year anniversary, there was a delegation of Osage people who came. They did a Catholic Mass in the Basilica in both Osage and French and English to kind of honor that. The Osage they call it Chouteau Town, and they sided with the French whenever they needed them. So there was a very strong relationship. This is just a quote from 1719 when Claude Charles Duchesne, he was descending a river into Osage Territory, and he had guns with him. And when the Osage stopped him, they checked out what he was going to trade. And they were opposed to him taking those guns further west. When I understood that they would not allow me to take my merchandise there, I asked them to let me go with only 3 muskets. So the Osage controlled the gun trade as much as they could, and it was not uncommon for them to stop somebody coming through their area or paddling through an area on a river and shaking them down. You know, what do you have? You're not going to take those. Of course, they couldn't do it forever, but the French era kind of ends this 1673. I mean, just to remind you that after the Revolution, right, the United States really only existed as this coastal region over here. And so in 1763, this is the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, which is what it was called in Europe. And the French lose, and so they cede all this land, which is, you know, everything from the west of the line of proclamation to the Mississippi River. They have to cede all that land to the British because that's who they lost to. And then everything to the west, everything to the west, which is Louisiana, they give that up, they cede that, they give that to Spain. So France is kind of out of the picture now, and it's kind of England here, the Americans, and then the Spanish. And so when the first Spanish governor, but the Spanish get it on paper, but they're never able to really impose their will on it because there's just not enough people. But when the Spanish get control of this, they see all these Osage running around with guns, and they are horrified. And they don't like the French approach to trade. They don't like this free trading. They don't like these unlicensed traders going out into the wilderness and just kind of doing their own thing. They definitely don't want to marry into the Osage tribe. And so they want to control trade. And by that, they want to have like specific identified traders, and everything goes through that person. And they can control it that way. So that way you're not out there and doing something different. And just to kind of give you a little bit more, just to show how different the Spanish were, sometimes the French would pay more than market value for the furs that they were buying from the Osage, just because they knew that the relationship was worth protecting. The Spanish were like, no way, we're not doing that. We're not going to let anybody out there do whatever they want to do. And we're definitely not going to encourage trading guns because we want to control these people. So the Spanish have a very, very different attitude and a very different mindset. And when they come in to control this area, they're also kind of worried about the English. And so they would like to control the Osage, and they'd also like to kind of have a buffer against the English. Well, this is just a quote from one of the governors from 1792. And in this quote, he basically says, any subject of His Majesty or any individual of any other nations, white or red, may overrun the great or little Osages, kill them, destroy their families, as they are disturbers of the prosperity of all the nations. So when the Spanish move in, it's kind of like open season on the Osage. If you want to go in there and rile them up, go right ahead. We'll support you. Because to us, they're costing us money, and they're not really behaving very well. So, okay, so this is kind of going on, and what happens then is that the Spanish give the trade monopoly, or they give that trading post power to Chouteau. And he actually stays on the Osage River with them, forms a very close bond with them. And he's keeping the Osage happy with all the guns that they want because he's making them tons of money. At this point, the Osage are now basically commercial hunters. Their lifeways, they're prior to the European contact, their sort of lifeways have adjusted. Now we've got horses and we've got guns, and there's money to be made and there's trade items to be acquired. And so this starts to pull apart a little bit at the Osage social fabric because most of the power was granted through heredity. So you were born into a chief's clan, and that meant you were going to be one. But let's say if I have a horse and a gun, and I can go out and I can raid the neighbors or steal some horses or acquire a lot of furs, now all of a sudden I've gained a certain standing in the tribe that's sort of beyond what that hereditary governmental structure would sort of allow for. So we begin to see some changes. Men start to take multiple wives because they're killing a lot more animals. And the women were the ones who would treat and tan the hides. And the Osage women created the best furs in the United States at that period. They were highly sought after, and they fetched the biggest dollars. Well, things weren't really going so well with the Spanish in control. At 1802, the Spanish decided they were done with Chouteau. You're no longer going to be the trade. You don't get the trade monopoly, and they gave it to a Spaniard, Manuel Lisa. And the Osage were like, hey, we don't know him, we don't like him, we don't want to deal with this guy, we like this guy. And also during this time period, the Spanish invite Indians, people from the east, to come over, and they grant them land. So you may know that just outside of Cape Girardeau, the Shawnee acquired a Spanish land grant for a plot of land. And this was on purpose. The Spanish wanted to bring more eastern tribes over so that they could irritate and maybe defeat the Osage. And so they also did the same thing with the Delaware people. And things got so bad that there were 2 attacks on St. Genevieve. The Osage rode in and attacked it twice. They killed some people. This was kind of a seat of Spanish power. This was kind of a way to sort of send a message. When Chouteau lost his trade relationship and it was given to this guy, Manuel Lisa, Chouteau still had trading rights on the Arkansas, and he convinced Black Dog and Claremore, these two guys, to move south. So not only do you have part of the social fabric and kind of the way that the political structure is working, but you also kind of have some tears now in terms of the tribal community. Now you start to see splintering and people going off into different sections, the Little Osage, the Great Osage, and now this Arkansas group. So Chouteau still had trading rights in Arkansas, and he formed the Arkansas Post, right where the Arkansas River comes into the Mississippi. And so he brought these Osage with him, and they went and hunted, and things just kind of continued as they had been before that. For a little bit. What's happening in the east at this time? I have two different maps. This is sort of showing these tribal locations as of 1760. The Delaware, the Shawnee. This is Indiana, Ohio. This is West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois. Well, what's happening over here is that the United States wants that old Northwest area. The Miami, yes, and they end up in southwest Missouri and right near, there's a town called Miami in southwest Missouri near Joplin, and of course they were mostly right there in Indiana at that time. But the United States wanted that territory for its settlements, and so in order to get this area, we have to have a place for them to go. Well, where do you think they're going? They're coming here, and we've already got problems. This map right here, it's not you can't really see it particularly well, but it outlines the movement of the Delaware people. The Delaware had a land grant down here, like in southeast Missouri, and then they also had a big chunk of land in southwest Missouri. And so if you research Delaware and Missouri, you'll find evidence that they had villages and they were here, but they were invited by the Spanish. And the idea was, let's try to upset the Osage. So the Shawnee, Delaware, Sac and Fox, Potawatomi, Miami, all of these people end up in what's Missouri, and all of them essentially end up at war with the Osage. So you can kind of see the deck is stacked. And of course, all these people are hunting people too, so this increases pressure on the game, so they have to travel wider and further into the hinterlands and into the plains and prairies. This also opens up more markets for the French to trade with, right? Hey, you know, if things aren't going well with your Osage, you can always ask somebody else. And it just becomes that much harder for the Osage to generally maintain their way of life. So the Treaty of Greenville, I'll just touch on this. This marks the end of the war for Ohio. This is where Tecumseh and the Shawnee are defeated, and they sign away the land, and it's this big chunk of Ohio right here, and it goes up into near the Great Lakes. And once this is open, it's already filling with white settlers who they got their eyes on that land. That's good farming country. But once this happens, you just displaced a big group of people, and they end up moving further west. You should look at Godspeed's History of Jefferson County. There's a great passage in here. At this point, the history of Jefferson County is discussing in the 1800s that Indians were already numerous, and they mention the Delawares, the Shawnee lived in St. Genevieve, Perry, and Cape County. The Osage were in Union in Franklin County, and the Cherokee lived on the White River. They said all the other ones were peaceable and friendly, but the Osage were very savage and warlike and gave the settlers a great deal of trouble. And of course, they were a warrior culture, and the land and the gifts that the land provided to them for their survival were considered, that's how they survived. So if you trespassed on their lands, you ended up like James Head. And he had his head cut off, and a piece of maple sugar was put into his mouth, and his head was put on a stake as a symbol, or as a sign. This is what happens to trespassers. So think about Charles Ingalls. Okay, so then there were smallpox and disease epidemics, and this further put pressure on their resources and kind of encouraged even a bit more. I know I'm probably going over the time. And they're splintering off into factions. In 1802, there was a smallpox epidemic, and as many as 2,000 of them died. So the Louisiana Purchase, right, we're speeding through time. The Spanish give it back to the French real quick, and then we buy it from the French, and now it's ours. And so Jefferson's idea is, we're not going to do what the French did. We're not going to do what the Spanish did. We're going to do something different. We are going to subdue them through commerce, specifically by putting them into debt. So we'll set up these forts, right? The Fort Osage, which was established in 1807 and run by George Sibley out on the Missouri River Valley. And the idea was we would have these specific locations. And they actually signed a treaty in 1808, and William Clark was the chief negotiator. Everything south of the Missouri River and everything north of the Colorado River is what they ceded in that 1808 treaty. And essentially what Clark told them was, hey, it'd be better for you to be under our protection. If you live by the fort, we'll take care of you. You'll have exclusive trading rights. You just have to give up all this land right here. And so, of course, a lot gets lost in translation. Some people who signed the treaty didn't necessarily have the authority to sign the treaty. And they probably didn't really understand what was in this treaty. But in 1808, that's exactly what happens. And Clark sends I think it's interesting that the Bureau of Indians was housed in the Department of War. But Secretary of War Henry Dearborn said, we got nearly 50,000, or Clark says to Dearborn, we got nearly 50,000 square miles of excellent country. And I promised the Osage some guns, a store, a blacksmith, a mill, and some plows. And then they'll be protected. And so we'll protect them from those eastern Algonquin people who are moving in. 1818, another treaty, the Portage de Sioux Treaty. This treaty essentially opens up the floodgates and sends the message to most Americans that it's safe to move in to Osage Territory. James Mason Peck, who was a missionary, wrote in his diary that the settlers came like an avalanche. It seemed as though Kentucky and Tennessee were breaking up and moving to the far west. And if you look at settlement patterns in Missouri, a lot of the people that ended up here were from Kentucky and Tennessee. And, uh-oh. Does that mean it's over?
Sorry, my husband's pill.
Uh-oh. Put his stuff outside the house tonight. The Spanish also arranged for the Cherokee to move into what was once their homeland near in the Arkansas White River area. And this was a really prime example of some dirty dealing. The Osage sold the land to the United States, and then the United States gave the land to the Cherokees. So this would be like you sell some land to the bank, and the bank gives it to your worst enemy, right? Because they did not like these Cherokee people. So this is a quote where Claremont's basically saying, look, we're hungry and naked, and the president set the Cherokees on this side of the river and gave them the land we sold him. So, of course, if you were Osage, I think that you'd feel very outraged. Why would you give them the land that we sold you? And this is this right here, this Dwight Mission right here, and it's this parcel of land right here. Essentially, the Cherokee and the Osage wage kind of a low-level, guerrilla war against each other from the time the Cherokee arrive until the time the Osage are ultimately removed. They're well armed, they have horses, there's a lot of them, and there's the balance of power is kind of tilted in their favor because they're getting free land that once belonged to the Osage that they sold. And things kind of escalated to 1817 at Claremore Mounds. There were 500 Western Cherokee who killed 38 Osage and took 104 captives. The Cherokee knew when the Osage would go away on their buffalo hunts, and so when all the warriors were out on the plains, they would come in and kind of destroy the village and kill whoever was there and take captives if possible. So this is Claremore Mound. This is near Rogers, Oklahoma. Rogers, Oklahoma, in that vicinity. So Missouri files for statehood in 1820. We become a state in 1821. We're one of the only states that gets bigger after we became a state. We bought this little fin of land in the Northwest Territory right here. That was the Platte Purchase that took place in 1836. That land was given to the, set aside for the Potawatomi, but they just looked too good. And so there was a lot of pressure and Missouri got bigger. Of course, the original Missouri didn't include the boot heel as well, but by 1830s, by 1825, the Osage signed a treaty, and they're gone. They'll never come back to Missouri. They are out of Missouri. So the big three treaties, 1808, 1818, 1825, they cede all of this land. That orange part is that stuff that they gave to the Cherokee. This was from the 1825, and then the yellow is from the 1808. For the 96.8 million acres that they ceded, they received $166,000 in cash, which works out to less than like a 1/16 of a cent per acre. 1829, Andrew Jackson, we will give Indians humane and considerate attention to their rights and wants. 1830, Indian Removal Act. We're moving them out of here. So that was a quick change of pace. And I'm skipping ahead, by 1869, they're here. So they went from way out in the east along the Ohio River, much of Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, as far west as the plains of, as far west as Colorado. And now they are on a strip of land 50 miles north and south and about 200, 300 miles east and west. Probably less than that, actually. And this is the town of Independence, and that's the Ingalls family cabin. But the Ingalls weren't alone. About 500 families were illegally squatting on this diminished reserve. Why? Because they knew that the Osage days were numbered, and if they squatted there, the Osage were removed in 1870 to Oklahoma. They could have stayed. It's weird. I don't understand why they didn't just stay, because they would have had that land. They didn't have to leave, and they could have homesteaded it, or any number of ways they could have got it. But this is a picture of the cabin in Kansas where they were. And again, Isaac Gibson in his report for 1870 says, look, the Osages were pillaged. Large amounts of wagon loads of matting hay were taken away, used by the settlers in building and finishing houses. They even new-made graves were plundered by the settlers with the view of finding treasures which Indians often bury with their dead. The question will suggest itself, which of these people are the savages, the Indians or the settlers? And so 1871, the Cherokee own all this land in northern Oklahoma, Indian Territory, and they sell this plot right here to the Osage. So again, it's the Cherokee. They got to buy it from their enemies, and they have this land. And the Cherokee sell it to them because it looks like it's really pathetic land, and it's not going to be good for anything. The Dawes Act, basically what they do is they take, we're going to skip the Dawes Act. It's another way to reduce the amount of land that the Indians have. Essentially, instead of each tribe being allowed to have a big chunk of land, they took the number of families in the tribe and divided it by the amount of land that they thought you should have, and that's what you got, and then all the leftover was put into public domain and then sold to settlers. So the Dawes Act was, helped, white people get more land that was formerly Indian country. So in the 1890s, they discover oil on this terrible land, and then every major oil company in the United States lines up at the door, and they want leasing rights. But since the Osage owned the land, and they then owned the mineral rights, and they became per capita the most wealthy people on the planet for a short period of time. They had white people as their domestic servants. They had cars, but this is a picture from Killers of the Flower Moon. People know that if you married a white man married an Osage, and then killed her off and her sister and her other sister and her other sister off, then they would get the mineral rights. And so that's all encapsulated in that book, Killers of the Flower Moon. Am I saying Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grunn? There's going to be a movie made by Martin Scorsese, and it's going to have Leonardo DiCaprio. In 1924, we let them become citizens, and then this is just kind of a review. All of this was ceded land, and then in the purple is what they ended up with. But the Osage continued to survive. There's about 21,000 people on the federal roll. By the 1890, their population was less than 2,000. If you want to read an excellent book, in addition to the book by Carolyn Fraser, I would recommend Killers of the Flower Moon. Most of their revenue streams are from white people gambling and oil, and there is an active language recovery program underway. If you can go to YouTube, you can find Osage language lessons if you're at all interested. And every Osage gets about $9,000 a year for tuition and healthcare. And I know that I'm over, so if anybody has a question, please.
How long were the Osage in North America before Europeans came?
Yeah, that's I don't know if anybody knows that far back, as I was kind of talking about that a little bit earlier. There's some debate in the scholarly community if they were from the east and then moved into the Ohio Valley area, if they were in that Cahokia region. There's just, I don't know if there's anybody who has archaeology or anthropology background, but to my knowledge, I don't know what the answer to that is. I apologize. I know this is making Roger very uncomfortable. But this is my concluding remarks. We are the inheritors of the world that was created by the decisions of people who came before us. And I think that we have to recognize that there was an episode in our history that involved the ethnic cleansing of the American Indians. And I think that we need to know more of the story by studying our history to kind of understand who we are, how we got here, and what obligation that we may or may not have for addressing the wrongs of the past. And so, thank you.